It's the autumn of 433 BC, and Athens is about to receive two delegations, one after the other. Both have come to ask the most powerful city in Greece for something, but their requests are incompatible. And when both have spoken, Athens will have to choose a side. The war that follows will last almost 30 years, kill hundreds of thousands, and end the Greek Golden Age. It all started here. But what did these delegations say? And what happened next? We are in ancient Greece, 430 years BC. This was a golden age. Athens built the famous Parthenon. Aeschylus and Sophocles filled the theaters, and Socrates debated in the streets. For over a decade, this world had lived in a fragile peace, held together by treaty, but not much else. And this peace was about to shatter. To understand why, and to truly understand what was at stake when the peace broke, we first need to understand the world it was holding together. In ancient Greece, there were no nations as we know them today. No king ruled them all, no capital united them. What existed instead was a constellation of independent city-states. Some of these are surely familiar to you. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes and Argos. Each city-state, or polis as it was called, was an independent and sovereign state, with its own laws and its own cultures. They were free cities. And for a long time, this system had been tested and had survived. A generation before our story begins, something extraordinary had happened. A threat had arrived from the east, so enormous and so overwhelming that it had done what nothing else in Greek history had ever managed to do before. It had forced the Greek city-states to stand united against the shared enemy, the Persian Empire. At its height, the Persian Empire was one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Its armies were not counted in thousands. They were counted in the hundreds of thousands. Its king, Xerxes, had brought an army to Europe over the Hellespont. He had come to conquer Greece and to bring these proud little city-states under the heel of his empire. Surprisingly, the Greek city-states held, and the defense of Greece was immortalized by battles such as the stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, and at the Bay of Salamis, where the Athenian fleet lured the Persian fleet into a trap and destroyed it. And finally, at Plataea, where the Greek forces met the Persian forces on land and drove them from Europe altogether. It was a most improbable victory. But the Greek unity born from the common enemy of Persia lasted just as long as the enemy did. The moment Xerxes turned his armies east and retreated, the question that had always divided the Greek world returned. Who among us deserves to lead? At the center of that question stood two rivals, Athens and Sparta. In the years that followed the Persian defeat, Athens moved fast. Too fast, many thought. Athens took the alliance built to defend against Persia, a constellation of island states and coastal cities called the Delian League, and transformed it, gradually, into something that looked less like an alliance and more like an empire. Tribute flowed into the Athenian coffers, and Athenian ships enforced the Athenian will across the whole Aegean Sea. And Sparta watched, and Sparta grew uneasy. That unease eventually hardened into war, a grinding, inconclusive conflict that dragged across the years and left both cities bloodied and exhausted, without either achieving anything close to victory, because Sparta could not break Athenian power at sea, and Athens could not dislodge Spartan dominance on land. And so, the war did not end with a triumph, it ended in a stalemate. And so, it was in the year 446 BC that Athens and Sparta signed a peace. The agreement they signed was meant to last 30 years. It drew an invisible line across the Greek world. And this is where our story begins. On one side stood Athens, the leader of the Delian League, a city of ships, silver, and democracy. Its power flowed not from its armies, but from the sea, from island to island, port to port, across the whole Aegean Sea. On the other side stood Sparta, the leader of the Peloponnesian League, disciplined, unyielding, a power rooted not in ships, but on land, in its soldiers. In soldiers who had trained for war from the moment they could hold a spear. The peace that was signed did not bring them closer together, as such agreements rarely do. Instead, it divided them. It formalized the division between Athens and Sparta. Each would remain within its own sphere of influence. Each would leave the allies of the other untouched. And so, the line that divided Greece held. For years it held. But beneath the surface, something had been shifting. Athens had not stood still. Through the Delian League, Athens had accumulated power on a scale no Greek city had ever achieved before. They had transformed what had begun as a defensive alliance against Persia into an empire in all but name. And Sparta watched again, and Sparta grew uneasy. Thucydides identified this as the future calamity's deepest cause, deeper than any treaty violation, deeper than any single incident. It was the growth of Athenian power, and the fear that that growth inspired in those who watched it. When a rising power unsettles an established one, the tension between them has a way of finding an outlet. This is called the Thucydides trap. Peace, Thucydides understood, is not the absence of war. It is the postponement of it. And somewhere in the Greek world, in a city that most Athenians or Spartans could not have placed on a map, this is where that postponement was about to end. The city lay far from Athens and far from Sparta. It was a small, insignificant city on the edge of the Ionian Sea, neither part of the Delian nor Peloponnesian League. It was here that the thread of that peace would first begin to unravel. The city was called Epidamnus. The city was not powerful. It was not famous. It sat on the fringe of the Ionian Sea, opposite the tip of the Italian heel on the coast of the Adriatic. It had been founded generations earlier by settlers from Corcyra, a large, prosperous island to its south that we know today as Corfu. For most of its history, Epidamnus had been an afterthought, the kind of place that appears in no great poem or no great battle. But inside Epidamnus, a civil war had broken out between the city's democratic and oligarchic factions. The losers had been expelled from the city, and once outside its walls, the exiles did what a desperate faction did when they refused to give up. They gathered their allies, they armed themselves, and they began to ravage the countryside. Epidamnus had been divided by politics and was now tormented by war. Desperate, the ruling faction still inside Epidamnus turned to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi was the most sacred source of guidance in the Greek world, believed to speak the voice of Apollo, the god of prophecy. And this voice was delivered through a priestess known as the Pythia. So deep in the sanctuary of Apollo, where the sacred flame burned and the air was thick with laurel smoke, the Pythia spoke. No one who entered that place left unchanged. Kings had bent their strategies to her words. Generals had staked armies on her counsel. And now a small, desperate city on the edge of the Greek world asked its question: what must we do to save our city? The answer came, as it always did, in few words. The oracle did not elaborate. It did not explain. It simply spoke and left the consequences to those who had to live with them.
Hand the city over to Corinth. Place yourselves under the protection of your founders.
The envoys carried those words home. It was the kind of answer that seems simple until you realize what it would set in motion. Corcyra, the island to its south, had founded Epidamnus, but they had in turn been founded by Corinth. So Corinth was the grandmother city. However, Corcyra had established a strong independence. It considered itself independent and saw Epidamnus as laying within its own sphere of influence, and therefore they did not want Corinth to have an influence there. But despite this, Epidamnus followed the oracle's instruction and sent envoys to Corinth, offering their city and asking for protection. And Corinth accepted. For Corinth, this was an opportunity. Corinth and Corcyra had long been in tension. The colony had grown too rich and too independent. If Corinth would take Epidamnus under Corinthian protection, that was a way of reasserting authority in the West. It was a way of reminding Corcyra who was still the master. But Corcyra was not ready to let this happen. Therefore, eager to rid themselves of future dangers, they demanded that all Corinthians staying inside Epidamnus leave at once. When the Corinthians inside Epidamnus and their Epidamnian hosts refused, Corcyra blockaded the city by sea and laid siege to it by land. As a response, Corinth sent a relief force. In the summer of 435 BC, just south of the island of Corcyra, the Corinthian and the Corcyraean fleets met in battle. In the fighting, Corcyra decisively defeated the Corinthians and captured about 15 ships, preventing Corinth from breaking the siege of Epidamnus. So in the end, Corinth left the battle defeated and utterly humiliated, beaten by their own colony and unable to claim Epidamnus. Corinth had lost influence over the Western Sea, but only for now. So Corinth withdrew, but only to prepare. Corinth rebuilt her fleet. Rowers were recruited from across the Peloponnese and beyond. They commissioned new triremes. Their intention was clear. A second battle, larger than the first. It was meant to settle the question of the Western Sea once and for all. The enormity of the Corinthian war preparations was enough to make Corcyra realize they could not defeat the might of Corinth successfully a second time. The question was, who would possibly help them? This brings us to Athens, when, in the autumn of 433 BC, one delegation came after the other. The Corcyraeans had come to ask Athens for an alliance. The Corinthians had come to prevent it. Thousands of people, Athenian citizens, gathered on the hill where assemblies were held. They would hear both cases, and it was time for one of the most important debates in Greek history. A herald called for silence, and a man stepped forward. A Corcyraean ambassador. He took a deep breath and spoke. Athenians, when a people that have not rendered any important service or support to their neighbors in times past, for which they might claim to be repaid, now appear before them, as we Corcyraeans now appear before you to ask for your assistance, they may fairly be required to satisfy certain preliminary conditions. They should first show that it is convenient, or at least safe, to grant their request. Secondly, they should show that they will retain a lasting sense of kindness shown by those granting the assistance. But if they cannot clearly establish either of these points, they must not be surprised if they are met with a refusal. Now the Corcyraeans believe that with this petition for assistance, we can give you a satisfactory answer on both points, and we have therefore dispatched this embassy here. It has so happened that our policy regarding you with respect to this request turns out to be inconsistent, and as regards to our interests, to be at the present crisis inconvenient. Now we say inconsistent because Corcyra, a power which has never in the whole of its past history been willing to ally itself with any of its neighbors, and is now found asking those same neighbors to ally themselves with it. And we say inconvenient because in our present war with Corinth, it has left Corcyra in a position of entire isolation. What once seemed the wise precaution of refusing to involve ourselves in alliances with other powers in order to not become entangled in risks of their choosing has now proved to be folly and weakness. It is true that in the last naval engagement, Corcyra single-handedly drove back the Corinthians from our shores, but Corinth has now gathered an even larger force from the Peloponnese and the rest of Greece, and we, seeing our utter inability to cope with them without foreign aid, and understanding the magnitude of the danger which subjection to them implies, find it necessary to ask help from you and from every other power. So we hope to be excused if we forswear our old principle of complete political isolation, a principle that was not adopted with any sinister intention, but was rather the consequence of an error in judgment. Now, there are many reasons why, in the event of you granting our requests, you Athenians will congratulate yourselves on this request having been made to you. First, because your assistance will be rendered to a power which, itself inoffensive, is a victim to the injustice of others. Secondly, because all that Corcyra most value is at stake in the present conflict, your welcome of us under these circumstances will be an act of goodwill which will always be kept alive. Thirdly, yourselves excluded, Corcyra is the greatest naval power in Greece. So Athenians, can you conceive a stroke of good luck more rare in itself, or more disheartening to your enemies, than that the power whose loyalty you would have valued above much material and moral strength, would present itself, self-invited, and deliver itself into your hands without danger and without expense, and should lastly give you a high reputation in the eyes of the world, the gratitude of those whom you shall assist, and a great addition of strength for yourselves. You may search all of history without finding many instances of a people gaining all these advantages at once, or many instances of a power that comes in quest of assistance, being in a position to give to the people whose alliance it solicits as much safety and honor as it will receive. Now, if it be urged that it is only in the case of a war that Corcyra shall be found useful, to this we answer that if any of you imagine that the war is far off, you are grievously mistaken. And you are blind to the fact that Sparta regards you with jealousy and desires war, and that Corinth holds great influence in Sparta. Corinth, remember, that is your enemy, and is even now trying to subdue us as a preliminary to attacking you. This Corinth does to prevent Corcyra and Athens from becoming united by common enmity, and to prevent Corinth from having both cities as its enemies at once. Corinth also seeks to ensure getting the advantage over you in one of two ways, either by crippling our power or by making our strength, our fleet, its own. Now, given this, it is our policy to be proactive, that is, for Corcyra to make an offer of alliance and for you to accept it. In fact, we are to form plans against Corinth, rather than waiting to defeat the plans Corinth is forming against us as we speak. If Corinth argues that it is not right for you to receive its colony into alliance, let them know that every colony that is well treated honors its parent state, but becomes estranged from it by injustice. For colonists are not sent forth to colonize with the understanding that they are to be treated as slaves to those that remain behind, but they are to be treated as equals. And that Corinth was injuring us is clear. When Corcyra invited Corinth to refer the dispute about Epidamnus to arbitration, Corinth chose instead to prosecute her complaints by war rather than by a fair trial. And let Corinth's conduct towards us, who are her own kin, be a warning to you not to be misled by their deceit, nor to yield to their direct requests. Concessions to adversaries only end in self-reproach, and the more strictly they are avoided, the greater will be the chances of security. If it be urged that your reception of us will be a breach of the treaty existing between Athens and Sparta, the answer is that Corcyra is a neutral state, and that one of the provisions of that treaty states that it shall be permitted for any Greek state that is neutral to join whichever side it pleases. It is intolerable that Corinth should be allowed to obtain men for its navy, not only from its allies, but also from the rest of Greece, and no small number being your own subjects. All this while Corcyra is to be excluded both from the alliance left open to us by treaty, and from any assistance that we might obtain elsewhere. And you, meanwhile, are to be accused of political immorality if you comply with our request. On the other hand, we Corcyraeans shall have much greater cause to complain of you, if you do not comply with our request. If we, who are in peril, and are no enemies of yours, are met with a repulse at your hands, while Corinth, who is the aggressor and your enemy, not only are met with no hindrance from you, but is even allowed to draw material for war from your subjects. This ought not to be. You should either forbid Corinth from enlisting men in your dominions, or you should lend us what help you think advisable. But your real policy is to afford us avowed countenance and support. The advantages of this course, as we premised in the beginning of our speech, are many. We mentioned one that is perhaps the main reason. Could there be a clearer guarantee of our loyalty than that which is offered by the fact that the power which is at enmity with you is also at enmity with us? Athenians, there is a wide difference between declining the alliance of an inland power and that of a maritime power. For your first endeavor should be to prevent, if possible, the existence of any other naval power except your own, but failing this, to secure the friendship of the strongest that does exist. And if any of you believe that what we urge is fitting, but you fear to act upon this belief, for fear that it should lead to a breach of the treaty, you must remember that, on the one hand, whatever your fears, your strength will be formidable to your adversaries. On the other hand, whatever the confidence you derive from refusing to receive us, your weakness will have no terrors for a strong enemy. You must also remember that your decision affects Athens as much as it does Corcyra. You are not making the best provisions for Athens' interests if you, while anxiously scanning the horizon for the war which is surely already upon you, hesitate to attach to your side a city whose adhesion or estrangement is coupled with the most vital consequences. Remember, Corcyra lies conveniently on the coast navigation in the direction of Italy and Sicily, being able to bar the passage of naval reinforcements from and to the Peloponnese. And it is in other respects a most desirable station. To sum up as shortly as possible, embracing both general and particular considerations, let this show you the folly of sacrificing us. Remember that there are 3 considerable naval powers in Greece: Athens, Corcyra, and Corinth, and that if you allow 2 of these 3 to become one, by Corinth securing Corcyra for itself, you will have to hold the sea against the united fleets of Corcyra and the Peloponnesian League. But if you receive us as allies, you will have our ships to reinforce you in the struggle. The Corcyraean sat down. He had said everything he could say, made every argument available to him, and it was a compelling case. In the assembly, minds started turning, positions started shifting, and the scales started moving in the Corcyraean direction. But Corinth had been sitting there, listening, waiting. They had heard every word, every appeal, every carefully constructed argument, and they had come to Athens prepared, not just to respond, but to dismantle every argument the Corcyraeans had made. Everything now rested on what Corinth was about to say. Next time, Corinth replies, and we will see which embassy managed to persuade the Athenian assembly and what it meant for the Greek world.